I found that I really particularly value being able to maintain that memory with the skull and the antlers when it's possible to keep that connection just really live. And so, I'll go and like touch it and like the memories will like flood back, and I remember tying it onto my backpack and carrying it out and how hard it was to get through the trees.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 3rd of February, 2022. For those of you who are new here, this show is out every 2 weeks, and it's alternating between the Living with Nature series, which is presented by Swarovski Optik, and that's what you're about to hear now, and a longer form conversation with a host of different people from around the planet, from explorers to biologists, hunters, fishers, and everything in between. Along with hosting this podcast, I am the Conservation Director at Modern Hunstman, which is a biannual publication dedicated to the sustainable use of wild resources and conservation. You can get the latest volume, Volume 8, all about conservation on the continent of Africa at modernhuntsman.com. I am also a filmmaker, which is actually what takes up most of my year, and you can see some of that work on byronpace.com or follow me on the various socials where I am at Byron J. Pace pretty much everywhere. But anyway, to this episode, which, as I said, is the Living with Nature series, it is based around 5 questions that I ask my guests about how they connect with nature. The intro to that was 2 weeks ago, so you can go back and listen to that if you want a bit of background about why this series started. But in this episode, you're going to be hearing from Lindsey Davis. She's a friend of the show, a contributor to Modern Huntsman, actually. She's an ecologist, an advocate of citizen science, and the current vice president of the Outdoor Alliance, to mention just a few of the things that she's involved in. But before we jump into that, just a quick shout out to the top tier Patreon supporters this month, who include Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of rdcontracting.co.uk, James Marchington, the guys at South Esher Stalking, Thomas Cameron, Mark Zabrowski, and Colin Knight. If you would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace. And with that said, please welcome Lindsey Davis to the show. Lindsey, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast, or welcome back to the Into the Wilderness podcast, because you've been on before. It's been a long time since you and I have actually seen each other in person. I think actually, thinking about it now, it was probably in Dallas 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years now.
Yeah. 2 years.
Amazing.
Wow, it doesn't feel like that long. No, we've been trying to line this up for a little bit for you to go through this Living with Nature series that's being presented by Swarovski Optics. And between me being very busy last year filming projects and you being an impossible person to tie down because you were also doing a lot of things, we finally managed to do it. But we're doing it because you've kind of you've been sat on the sofa for a little while, not because you're being lazy or because it's the festive period or post-festive period, but because you've had a major shift in your life, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, I endured or facing it is what it feels like, getting a very old and painful knee injury fixed in December. So on the 22nd, I'm just about two plus weeks out right now from getting a partial knee replacement, which is crazy at my age. I think the average age of people who get that surgery is like 67. But I had just destroyed my knee starting when I was in 19 or so, playing sports, and just over and over again had big ligament reconstructions and injuries and such, and my lifestyle just used it all up, Byron. So I had a big surgery and everything's going really well so far. I definitely, if anybody ever wants to talk about knee pain, knee problems, or health in that regard, I'm all ears. And I have been really grateful for the healthcare professionals and kind of support team that has showed up in my community, and also just people on Instagram who've gone through similar things. And the general conversation around health in my life has been really enjoyable. So yes, I'm couch bound and trying to be patient about it right now.
Which is why I was able to lock you down for a date. So I'm grateful for that. But tell me, just before we get into these questions, had it got to the point where it was severely impacting your life to do the kind of thing? Because you're a very active person, you spend a lot of time in the outdoors, a lot of time fishing, but also just in the outdoors in general. Were you getting to the point where you could no longer do those things?
Yeah, it's been this really precipitous drop off in capability over the last couple of years. It's always been something I've had chronic pain around, and usually I've just managed it because the passion for the things that I'm doing sort of distracts me from that pain. And I also do a ton of physical therapy and just rehab. And, anytime I was coming home from a day of hunting or hiking or something, I would be icing and doing e-stim and taking supplement, just had this regiment to try and push this out as far as I possibly could. But yeah, it got to the point where nothing I was doing was pain-free, from waking up in the morning and getting out of bed to, of course, like elk hunting and carrying a pack. So
That doesn't help.
it just, no, it does not help. But I have a really awesome, it's so important with these kinds of things to find healthcare professionals who treat you like the athlete you are and respect your lifestyle. And I've definitely found those people here in Salt Lake. And, they're the kind of folks that say, we don't want you living in a bubble. We don't want you stopping doing the things you're doing. We know you're going to do these things anyway. Like, live your life and we'll mop it up on Monday when you come back and see us. And let's figure out how to, keep you doing the things that you love in a way that also supports longevity. So it's been cool trying to figure out what that balance is for myself and have tons of support along the way.
Have you, did they rebuild your knee with bits of you, or do you have bits of somebody else in your knee, or is it all synthetic components?
I actually have like a huge metal implant. So I have a proper bionic knee, an artificial knee, because it was just collapsed and bone on bone. In fact, when they opened it up, the surgeon told my husband, he was like, I've never seen a knee this bad in someone her age. She's a coper. And I was like, well,
Ooh.
at least everybody just, everybody knows how much I was sucking it up. But yeah, it's cool now because even just a couple weeks out, like it's super painful, but the pain's not in the spot where it used to be. So it really shows that this might really improve my life. So I'm pumped. I'm getting excited about the season, and already drew some cool tags this year that I'm getting really excited about. So I think, those are the things that keep me eyes on the prize right now. I'm planning a caribou hunt in Alaska this fall, and that's been in the
Amazing.
works for years now, and definitely strategically put that at the end of this recovery path so that I would have something to keep me focused and keep my spirits up.
With that said, let's jump into the first question then, because I think you're kind of alluding to maybe some of the answers to these. But for question one, how do you connect with nature on a regular basis?
So I love this question because there are 1,000 ways to do this. And I think that figuring out what this means for us all as individuals is like one of the most enjoyable things on life's path. But for me, I've really found, I was thinking about this, and food is the way that I feel the closest connection. And I think it's because I have these moments all throughout the year where I'm either gardening or hunting or harvesting or searching for wild plants. And I'm constantly, finding those opportunities to collect and harvest and store and like bring nature into my life by the way of food. And then it's like these days where I'm only working and I'm on the computer for 10 hours, and then I get to have dinner and it's this amazing elk steak, or even just the simple things of a cup of nettle tea that I harvested. I get to bring those memories back of how I acquired those things, where I was, what the day felt like. It's this really special way that I can kind of reflect and relish and be nurtured by my relationship to wild places, no matter what's happening in my life. So I think oftentimes I don't necessarily get outside or get into the mountains every day, but food makes me feel that connection kind of no matter what's happening.
It's interesting because when I interviewed Ben, which was only like a week or two back, he was saying how his relationship with nature had shifted because he had done for the very first time in his life. I'm not quite sure how old Ben is, but I guess he's 40 plus, and he had gone hunting for the first time in his life, and he felt like his connection had shifted because he was now kind of participating in it. And from what you've just said there, I think it's interesting to see that as your sort of constant connection, because it is something that you've kind of you've definitely participated in and taken from nature. Whereas I would imagine a lot of people thinking about the question, if you're thinking about it as a podcast listener at home, it would probably be about being out in nature. But this is almost like back in your home, taking the outside in.
Yeah, and even the garden, like little memories that come up from just time in my backyard, especially now that it's wintertime and everything's dormant and I'm not getting out. I'm actually quite restricted in what I can do. I'm feeling that the importance of that connection more than ever because I can sink into those experiences and kind of time travel a little bit through the meals that we're able to have. So
I
yeah,
love that. That's
it's
beautiful.
special.
For people who hunting something living might be just a step too far, what are the easy ways for them to enjoy a little taste of what you're talking about participating in something outdoors, but being able to bring it inside to your kitchen as sustenance? And
Yeah, I
I
love
mean, gardening is one thing. Like a lot, I think a lot of people will think, well, I can go and plant carrots or grow potatoes or something. But I'm thinking more on the kind of wild harvesting side.
totally. Yeah, I love this question because hunting takes a ton of work, knowledge, planning, skills, process, the tags with the state, all that kind of thing. It's a much more complicated way to build that connection, and I think there's dozens of steps that we can all enjoy kind of getting to that point. Over the summer, I taught a class which was all about the 10 wild edible weeds that you can find anywhere on the continent, no matter where you are in cities or even out in the mountains and such. And
That's
I
awesome.
think, yeah, it's super cool because I actually flew up to Montana to teach the class at the Sitka headquarters and had never been there, but I was pretty confident just based on what these plants are that they would be available in this like office park next to the freeway.
Yeah, I know we
And
missed each other by like 2 weeks because I was there like just after you finished
oh,
up.
Bummer, yeah. But I went up there, and within 5 minutes of walking around this building, I found 7 of the plants on my list that all present some type of edible or medicinal value. And I think people often overlook weeds, but there are these incredible pioneer species that have like can really become your first aid kit or your next superfood, and they're everywhere. They're free, in a lot of other cultures, things like dandelions are like incredible superfoods, but we've just framed them in such a way where we don't think about them like that. But so I think that's a really cool place to start because it doesn't matter where you are. You don't really need to leave your house or your neighborhood. They're free, they're available, they're easy to identify, they present tons of awesome healing qualities. And then beyond that, it's like once you start to so I think like starting to identify plants and mushrooms and things like that, like getting field guides and learning how to key out species and just study detail and things so that you can feel confident identifying different species is an awesome place to start. And then you can grab those books and take them on a walk and get into the foothills or get into the mountains or spend time looking at different seasons that are happening and what might be popping up in all those different points of the year. And it's super fun, and I think a really kind of low barrier to entry way to start becoming a wild food harvester and someone who's knowledgeable about those sorts of things.
That's a great answer to the question. Thank you, Lindsey. Well, with that, let's go to question 2, which is do you have any good examples of how companies, people, or organizations are helping to rebuild this connection between people and nature. This is kind of like a perfect lead-in from what the one example that you've given as an individual yourself in terms of recommendations. But do you have any other really good examples of things that are working and rebuilding that kind of broken bond with
Yeah,
nature that people have now?
totally. Yeah, I love thinking about this, and I think where my mind kind of originally went is like there's amazing hunters and harvesters and farmers and poets and artists and all sorts of people that I've been inspired by for decades now. But this question makes me think about something brand new, which is sort of on the more cutting edge side of how mainstream society is starting to think about nature. And I recently got introduced to the folks over at Nature Quant, and they're doing some really interesting stuff with clinical trials around what the effects of time in nature and being exposed to the outdoors actually does for our health. And this sounds very basic to those of us who love the outdoors and understand that time spent outside or time spent in a wild place restores our spirit, makes us feel better, gets fresh air into our lungs. We've known those anecdotes and those feelings for ever, but now we're getting to the point where mainstream society is looking at it from a clinical standpoint through these folks' work, and I love just the potential that unlocks for where we go from here. A lot of the things that this group is talking about is being the fourth ring on the Apple Watch, so that you are actually prescribed, okay, I need to get 30 minutes of time outside because that's a benefit to my mental health, and your doctor's tied into this, and your whole care team is thinking about it, or it's part of how we look at the school system. And I love just thinking about how this could be a more mainstream concept rather than sort of the expedition style way of thinking of being outside that can be super overwhelming to folks. And then the other side of the project that they are working on is this thing called a nature score, where they're actually looking at urban areas and rural areas, but thinking about like, where are the trees? Where is their waterfront? Where is their fresh air? And actually grading areas based on the availability of nature, parks, all that sort of stuff. And I think this is going to be really motivating for city planners, local legislators, all the folks that are like, well, I'm going to want my city to be, in the top 10 of the nature score. Or, hey, why didn't we rank higher? And it's like, oh, because there's these large communities that actually don't have access to a park within walking distance of their house. And this was so critical during COVID when all the lockdowns were happening. And the Trust for Public Lands did a study that showed that 100 million people were without access of a park within walking distance of home in the US. So that's just like devastating. And so I think a lot of this research and sort of the more empirical way of going about looking at nature and its effects on our health and well-being are going to help a lot of the sort of structural aspects of who gets exposed to it and gets access and where it is and where the funding goes and how we prioritize it as a society.
That's interesting. I have mentioned this on the podcast at least once before, but in Scotland, the GPs here can actually prescribe a green prescription, and it's literally on a green notepad. And it is, I prescribe you for some of the issues that you've come to see me for 30 minutes a day outside. And I want you to walk along the river or take a walk in the
That's
park.
cool.
And I suppose they're seeing it now. Pretty much what you're saying is that it is a way to mitigate some of the problems that people are otherwise medicating for. And if you take it a step further and you think about, well, in order to have these wild or natural spaces, they do cost something. They cost something to be maintained. There's an opportunity cost. You can always build on it. But if these these spaces in nature are good for people's health, which we know that they are, then that actually has a value. So it's like it could be seen as an ecosystem service, which has a value and so should be valued as such. Because I mean, in a country like here in the UK where I am, where there's a national health service, by people spending more time in nature and reducing, say, the issues that they might have around mental health, they're now not going to see the doctor, which is a cost on the health service by the fact that they have access to nature.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody is paying for it somewhere. So that's fascinating. I hadn't heard
Yeah.
of the organization you're talking about, so I guess people can go and check them out.
Yeah, it's Nature Quant, and they have a really cool website that explains what they're doing a lot better than I am. But yeah, I think it shows incredible promise for kind of where the value of the outdoors is going to be accepted and prioritized.
Question 3. Is there a conservation story happening right now that you're particularly passionate about? And I'm sure you probably have a million to choose from, but is there one sort of standout?
I do have a favorite. Yeah.
Tell me.
I, I am, and it's kind of just a general concept, but there's so much progress happening with wildlife corridors right now.
Yay.
And I think it's just endlessly cool because it's combining all of these different things to solve a very real, pressing modern issue and this collision of development and humans and wildlife. So for years, I've been a part of this citizen science study here in Utah, where we use motion sensor cameras to measure human disturbance on the wildlife populations and study where the population densities are. And all of that information creates these incredible maps that show, where the highest density is, where they're getting stuck, all that stuff. And then, of course, like in all the bordering states around me here in Utah, especially in Wyoming, they've been doing this work for years with all of the collaring work that they're doing of migration of mule deer in the West. And so all of that research is just starting to be impossible to argue with. And the maps and data, of course, like all the work that Joe Reese has done over the years, documenting the migrations, it's incredible. And when you have that data and those stories, you can't argue with what's needed. And we're seeing funding go, like just this past year in the infrastructure package, there was funding for wildlife corridors and major funding. And it's so exciting to me to see that happening and have it be okay, this is a part of how we're looking at transportation now. What are we going to be doing for the wildlife that are also, colliding with our impacts? And so that use of technology is just creating a ton of proof. And I love seeing it. And there's a huge overpass that was built in Parley's Canyon up I-80, which is a big one coming, across the country and in and out of Salt Lake here. And I've seen a ton of press and media about how many hundreds of animals crossed the bridge in the last year. And people are just, they feel a part of it, and they're able to kind of get this glimpse of normally unseen wildlife crossing this awesome bridge. And it's cool. And so I think people are super engaged. And I love seeing all of the different conservation groups in my state, like the Utah Wildlife Federation has convened all these different a working group that has all the different interest groups around wildlife, and everybody's coming to the table for this concept. So I love seeing its progress, and I think really the sky's the limit with this kind of stuff as we understand animal behavior and their needs, and it's such a pressing time as all of the wintering grounds are like continually under pressure, and we're just building more and more. And I think, the true conservationist in me wants to say no more buildings, but the reality is that they're going to happen. So how do we do it in a way that makes the most sense for wildlife? And that's what this research is making us. That's what's making it possible.
It's such a great example because it is applicable probably in every country in the world, and necessary in almost every country in the world. Because otherwise, we talk, or we have talked a lot about in the media about fences and the issue with fences and agriculture for the movement of animals. But roads are basically like a fence, particularly big networks of roads, and then it forces these island populations, essentially. That's how they behave, because they either can't cross them or they try and cross them and they die. So you don't end up with a lot of crossovers. So what a brilliant example. To question 4. Is there someone in particular who inspires you and is doing great work in the outdoor space?
I think that for me, it's not somebody in particular, but it's this general movement that's happening right now. I work on the daily in the recreation space and am largely representing a coalition of businesses and the recreation economy to the government. So my day to day, I'm championing these things that we're talking about and trying to get people to value and understand the positive economic impacts of recreation, how that ties into public lands health and funding, and the general sort of health and well-being of Americans. And it's incredible to see this movement over the past year and a half, largely pushed by COVID and lockdowns, and people rediscovering their passion and value for the outdoors over that time period. And there's so much cool stuff happening that I think is really going to get us over the line into a true 21st century recreation economy and recreation infrastructure, which of course has direct impacts for aquatic species health, wildlife, habitat, ecosystem health, the national park system, all the funding that's going towards wildfire mitigation, all the things that are just direly needed right now. Because recreation is such an economic driver, and we're able to tell that story, it allows there to be kind of statistics and a really clear way of thinking about the benefits to society and sort of the natural world. And there's such cool stuff happening. We just, right before the end of the year, had the first ever title hearing on recreation in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which is a big deal. That's never happened before. They were looking at over a dozen different bills that would improve recreation permitting processes and all sorts of different things for how the agencies manage for recreation and how the public gets to interact with it. And so all of that is just, the government responds to what generally the people want and what people are asking for and people are demanding. In addition to they're going to national parks. So the agencies are saying, hey, we need help. We have all these new visitors. And so this just general trend about how important the outdoors is now to Americans is creating all of this opportunity that's going to, I think, change how we think about land management in this country. Like a lot of the policies that were put in place decades ago, recreation wasn't the number one thought. It was about logging or it was about a different type of management. And now we have proof that that's actually one of the highest uses of the land for both the ecosystem and for people. So I think that this is going to create an opportunity for just better land management across the board. And I'm really excited to see so many different stakeholders kind of singing from the same songbook. And a time where things are super divided, it's like recreation is winning. And it's the thing that people are able to come to the table together about, no matter what their political identity might be. And that's just super cool to see.
Not to dive into this too much, but with more people realizing what they get out of being in the great outdoors, how do you balance that with impact and being able to fund mitigation measures for the fact that there is now way more people outside? A very easy, simple example is just walking trail corrosion, a piece of metal, erosion from footfall.
Yep. This is entirely an issue of people not knowing that there are plenty of places to go. So I think we get these clogged popular places, and for whatever reason, there can be another campground or another trailhead that's just a few miles away that might not be on the map or might, need. There's a ton of deferred maintenance on public lands right now, which is a large reason why the Great American Outdoors Act was passed last year. And there's now 5 years of funding that's being pumped into.
That was exciting.
Yeah, and it's like to make sure the bridges are sound and the bathrooms are sound and the campgrounds can stay open so that people don't have to go to just one spot. So all of the agencies and land managers right now are trying to keep up on the infrastructure side and sort of restore the things that haven't been kept up or managed in decades so that we do have enough places for people to go. And just looking at like how much public land is available in this country, it is absolutely an issue of disbursement. And I think, some of there's a bill called the SOAR Act, which is about simplifying outdoor access. And there's a bunch of other bills in that recreation process package that change how the agencies share information about visitation. And if the agencies are all using, the BLM, National Forest, state parks, everybody are all using the same kind of data tracking processes, then there's no reason that I think and also using kind of the public and private sector. Right now, if you look up a CVS in your neighborhood or a Walgreens, you can tell if it's busy because it says busy. And you're like, okay, I think I'll plan my trip in an hour or two when it's not busy. But there's no way to do that for a trailhead. It might be cool
Interesting.
if there is
Okay,
one.
that would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah, we have all this modern technology that's tracking where we're going, and people, especially recreators, are using this stuff all the time to track their mileage and all that stuff. And if a trailhead's going to be, the parking lot's going to be full, you can pick one that's just down the road or going to a different place. So I think we just need to really modernize how we're thinking about and planning for recreation. And there's a ton of irons in the fire for how we do that. And of course, managing for the natural resource is everybody's priority. Like, our industry doesn't exist without healthy natural resources. So I think oftentimes, we can get dinged for being extractive, or, there's all sorts of ways that people kind of talk poorly about recreation. But in truth, when you look at where the funding for public lands and conservation is coming from, it's coming from all the gas taxes and all the registration taxes and the excise taxes and the use fees. And so it really is the money that's driving keeping these places open and available.
To the last question, do you have, of all the cool things that you do and places you've been, do you have a singular, real standout memory of connecting with nature?
Oh my goodness. I am so hung
You can
up
only pick one.
I have one that is just front and center for me right now, which is this October, I harvested my first ever bull elk. And um, I just, got the Euro mount hung up on my wall in the kitchen. And so I'm in that phase where every time I walk through the kitchen, I sort of stop and look and just feel an incredible amount of feelings. And it is one of the coolest things I've ever done, one of the hardest things I've ever done. I had hunted a cow season, I think twice before, and a bull season last year, unsuccessful. And this year I spent 8 days in the mountains pursuing elk in one of the lowest success units in the state of Utah. It's a hard spot to hunt, and ended up making it happen on the very last morning, on the very last ridge that I was like, I'm going to punch it to this ridge and I'm going home. And I think every day past day 3, I wanted to go home. And had, the thoughts in my head of, maybe this just isn't for me. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Okay, I'll give it one more day. Okay, I'll give it one more day. And just kept doubling down and recommitting to the next day that was ahead of me, because there was a lot of mental hardship, physical hardship, and just heartbreak of blowing opportunities or missing opportunities or being just out of range, and just feeling how absolutely incredibly challenging it is to pursue bull elk. So managed to make it happen on the very last morning in a way that just was the coolest. Like, I ended up finding, we'd found a couple elk here and there. And the last morning I ended up stumbling into like 60 elk, and I cow called, made a perfect shot. The 2 bulls that I was looking at were sparring. It was just the most
incredible,
awesome experience, and then had friends who helped me pack out, and then spent the next 4 days actually butchering the meat at home, which I
It's
love
a lot of
butchering.
meat.
I know. And I usually, it's like this party in my kitchen where we're drinking whiskey and we're listening to music and we're staying up late and we're just so happy. And by day 3, I was like, okay, I'm done with this mess. Like this is an incredible amount of work. But yeah, it took all of my skills, Byron. It took absolutely everything I had from, my tracking and nature awareness, my mental determination, every ounce of physical fortitude that I could drum up. And so just to feel the immense challenge of that, and especially as I was kind of ready to quit many times before it happened, to have it be successful just feels like magic in my world.
That is tremendous. And I know what you're saying about the butchering process, because I really like butchering, but not when I have like 4 carcasses hanging out. By the time you get to like the third one, it's like, I'm done. In fact, when I get off this podcast with you, I need to go and stir my cicadilla stew that I'm making that's on the cooker right now from something I butchered like
Yeah.
2 weeks ago or something. But I just want to ask you one last question
Yeah.
before we wrap up, which is, I mean, you've given us a very short but amazing account of that experience. But you started off by saying that every time you walk into the room, that the skull and antlers is on your wall, you get some of that back. To many people, they won't get that. They're, okay, well, I understand the appreciation of eating the meat, but do you really need to put these antlers and the skull of the animal on the wall? What do you think of? What do you feel? What emanates from it when you're seeing it?
It's really similar to how we started this conversation, which is that nature connection, right? And like how memories can transport us to a time and an experience that we've had that was, deeply physical, deeply visual, deeply memorable. And, that meat's going to be gone at some point. And sure, I'll be able to enjoy it and feel those feelings I was describing, but the same thing happens when I get to look at that skull, And so I think the trophy itself is really important, and that's something that I didn't necessarily feel in the beginning of hunting, and I have felt that way after harvesting a cow elk where I didn't save the skull. And once that meat was gone, it was like, oh, I've lost, I only have the memories that I can conjure up myself from my brain now, or the photos, which is plenty and enough. I know there's a lot of issues around this topic, but I've found that I really particularly value being able to maintain that memory with the skull and the antlers, when it's possible to keep that connection just really live. And so, I'll go and like touch it and like the memories will like flood back, and I remember tying it onto my backpack and carrying it out, and how hard it was to get through the trees with these antlers on my back, and thinking about, wow, these elk have to do this every day. How do they bushwhack, and just all that stuff. So it just becomes very personal very quickly. And I really value that.
Well, that's a beautiful answer to a very difficult question. And with that, thank you so much, Lindsey, for coming back on the show and sharing your living with nature thoughts.
Thank you, Byron, for having me, and thank you for being such an inspiration. I love following your globetrotting adventures and conservation, so keep it up.
And I hope I can see you again in person soon.
Me too. Let's plan on it.